Hey guys, and welcome to this video in which I'm going to go over the tribe of Dan and his association with the constellations of Scorpio as a primary and the constellation of Libra as a secondary. So in Genesis chapter 49, Israel, gives a prophecy to each one of the tribes of Israel. And I'm not going to go through all of them. Obviously, Judah is the line of the tribe of Judah. He talks about being a lion's whelp, but he talks about Dan in Genesis 49:16. He says, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. And then he says, Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path that biteth the horse's heels, so that his rider shall fall backwards. It's widely accepted, almost unanimously in all the research that I've done, that the constellation of Scorpio was assigned to the tribe of Dan. There are some suggestions that Dan did not accept the adder because obviously the connotations that come along with it, but also that he preferred the eagle to be on his banner. So each of the tribes of Israel had a banner which they were assigned. And I'm just going to go over some research to show you that Dan was assigned the constellation of Scorpio. So here in this book, the Hierophant, which was written by a Stuart Grover in 1859, when Jacob gave his blessings to the 12 patriarchs, he assigned the serpent to Dan. Dan is a serpent, an adder in the path, but about this time the serpent fell below the equinox, became a sign of evil import, and Dan rejected him for his monogram because Scorpio was the sign accursed. So in ancient Israel, at about that time at the equinox, what would happen is when the sun started to move into Scorpio, that's when the autumn would come, and it would become winter. So not only was Scorpio a sign of evil, but it was also a time of winter coming, and the crops not flourishing. And then he goes on to say that Antares in the heart of Scorpio marked the autumnal equinox. So autumn meant that winter was coming in the Chaldean and Egyptian zodiacs. But Dan and probably others rejected Scorpio because it had become the sign accursed, and in its place adopted the eagle having the star Altair for its emblem. So it's supposed that Dan rejected the sign of Scorpio and instead used an eagle. But as you can see, if you have a look at the banner of Dan, it's either a snake or a basilisk, or it's the scorpion or Scorpio. So one of the things I'm hoping to show you guys in this video is that Scorpio was very much considered a serpent or a dragon in history. So when John describes a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and that dragon as being Satan, which is later described in Revelation chapter 12, that can very much be associated with the sign of Scorpio. And also Mars as well, being protectorate, as the astrologers used to believe, over Scorpio. The two can go hand in hand. So Mars was kind of associated with the sign which we now call Scorpio. So in ancient Greek mythology and in ancient Egyptian mythology, the Typhus, which is also the python, was associated with the constellation of Scorpio. So the story goes that Typhon or Typhus, this multi-headed monster, kills Osiris, and Zeus, who's Osiris's father, then strikes Typhon with a thunderbolt and binds him under Mount Etna. So obviously that's a very perverted and distorted version, but it does have certain allusions to Jesus Christ being pierced and Satan being bound in the tribulation. So in ancient Greek, if John were talking about this story and they had to relate it to the stars, Greek mythology would certainly associate the multi-headed monster Typhon with the constellation of Scorpio. So in this book, which is Moses in the ancient Egypt and the hidden story of the Bible, it says here, It is thought that Set is the root name of Satan, which is the most interesting for its association with the zodiac sign of Scorpio, the destroyer. Among the Greeks, Set's equivalent was the archetypal Typhon, the destroyer of Zeus and the Olympians. Typhon's legs were great rolling sea waves. His head was a fiery smoking furnace, imagery which symbolically links him with an erupting volcano and its resultant tidal wave. And even in The Wicked Person, who was Aleister Crowley, this is his book Magic at Aleister Crowley, he associates Satan with Typhon and Typhon with Scorpio. So Satan, or the Egyptian Set, was the brother to Osiris, the son who plotted his assassination. The Greek equivalent of Satan was the 100-headed devil Typhon. So there's this allusion to multiple heads, which you find when you're researching Typhon. And at the autumnal equinox, the scorpion of Scorpio is said to sting the sun to death as the hours of darkness became greater. So you see that was heading into winter. And in this book, the American Magazine and Repository of Useful Literature, which was written in 1841 by B. Wood, he goes on to talk about Scorpio and Typhon, this multi-headed beast. So he goes on to talk about the star Antares, which is the red star, and says Antares is much used to nautical men, is one of the best stars from which to reckon the moon's distance for calculating the longitude at sea, and is the most brilliant star for many degrees round, and is of a remarkable bright red appearance. It is located in the heart of Scorpio and is one of those 4 bright stars which formerly answered to the equinoctial and celestial points. This sign was previously represented by the ancients, sometimes as a crocodile and others by a serpent. So Scorpio was represented to the ancients as some type of a reptile or some type of a serpent, but more generally by the scorpion. It appears to be represented by the latter symbol when the vernal equinox corresponded with Taurus. So what would happen was it would start to become winter in Scorpio, and then it would start to become summer in Taurus. And obviously the precession of the equinox has changed now. And it says that about 2,000 years ago, so the sign represented by Scorpio is of remote antiquity, and this is proven by Ovid's allusion to it, where it is spoken of as the most terrific of all celestial monsters. He then goes on to say Scorpio, by the ancient Egyptians and the Greeks, because this is later the same in Greek mythology, was said to represent Typhon or Typhoeus, who was a giant of unparalleled cruelty. You see clearly here, guys. Later on, he also says that by the Hebrews, Scorpio is ascribed to Dan. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, an adder in the path. Mars was the tutelary deity of Scorpio. So Mars, he is saying, is associated with Scorpio. Hence, this constellation was confounded with the planet Mars. The alchemists held that iron could not be transmuted to gold while Scorpio reigned. So basically, guys, what I'm trying to show you here is Mars and Scorpio are associated together, and they're both associated with fire-breathing dragons, both of them. And then in this book, Morals and Dogma of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, so all this esoteric knowledge they think that this knowledge is so wonderful and wisdom is being passed down to them, but in actual fact we can glean the truth out of it because we know the truth. So we associate, we know that the Bible is the Word of God, and that is the truth. And we can pick out certain things from here and come to our own conclusions about it, and we can safely do that because the Holy Spirit will witness the truth to us. So in this book he says, when the sun was in Scorpio, Osiris lost his life, and that fruitfulness which is under the form of the bull he had communicated through the moon to the earth. Typhon, there he's talking about this creature that was associated with Scorpio. Typhon had his hands and feet horrid with serpents. So Typhon is associated with having multiple heads and multiple hands as serpents. And then it says further on in this book, it says Osiris was slain by Typhon, his rival, with whom conspired the queen of Ethiopia, by who, says Plutarch, were designated the winds. The parallentations of Scorpio, the sign occupied by the sun when Osiris was slain, were the serpents, reptiles, which supplied the attributes of the evil genie and of Typhon, who himself bore the form of a serpent in the Egyptian planisphere. So it used to be a serpent, which was in the place of Scorpio right now. So when I say that Scorpio is the dragon and Scorpio is the serpent, that very much fits in with ancient history. Also in Luke chapter 10 verses 19, Jesus himself makes an allusion to snakes and scorpions being together. He says, "Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." So Jesus himself associates snakes and scorpions together. And interestingly, the birth of the church, the Revelation chapter 12 sign, Jupiter being the child, is heading towards a large scorpion, and Jesus said that nothing shall by any means hurt us. In Deuteronomy chapter 8 verses 15, Moses, when the fiery serpents came upon the people, let's not also forget that there were scorpions there. So here we see in Deuteronomy chapter 8 verses 15, it says, "Who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions, and drought, there was no water? Who brought thee forth water out of the rock?" So we see that scorpions and serpents are very much associated with one another. So in Francis Rolliston's book on the Mazzaroth, which is called by the same name, this is probably the best book on the stars that exists for Christians to research the gospel in the stars. She notes that the constellation of Libra was not born on any of the banners of the tribes of Israel. Simeon and Levi being united under the emblem of Pisces, but would be on the breastplate. So if we consider Libra as the holy altar and the throne room of God, which Jupiter is just about to head into, then obviously that wouldn't be born on any of the banners, because that would belong to the tabernacle or the holy altar or the temple. So it's very interesting that Libra was not on the banners of Israel. So you're probably wondering why I'm going on about the tribe of Dan being associated with Libra and Scorpio. And the reason is because as much as I've tried to find out why Dan is associated with Scorpio and all the evidence that represents, I'm still confused as to why Dan is called a judge of his people. And the word judge there is used in the connotation of a judgment. He's the judge of his people. He's going to bring judgment to the people of Israel. And we also see that Dan, if you research the images that are associated with Dan, you'll see that a lot of people have associated the image of Libra with Dan, because Libra is the scales and the judge. So this would mean that God, in his foreknowledge, knew that the constellations were going to be perverted into something which they weren't. So the constellation of Libra was the holy altar and the throne room of God, but he obviously knew that was going to be perverted and changed into scales, but also that Scorpio would be reaching up to try and attempt to grab the holy altar, and that Dan would be associated with the constellation of Scorpio. So in this book, which is called The Secret Astrology of the Bible, it says here, if we examine the organization of the passages, we see that Dan is listed twice, and Simeon and Levi are lumped together. In the second blessing, Dan is called the judge of his people. Dan is also Libra. To the Greeks, Scorpio and Libra were part of the same constellation. Most likely they were separate constellations in Babylon. So Scorpio and Libra form one constellation, and Dan is associated with both of those constellations currently. Scorpio grabbing the constellation of Libra, which is the holy altar. And there are many writings of the Antichrist coming from the tribe of Dan. So what we have to remember is that Dan isn't just the tribe, it's also a place. There was a place called Dan. So there are a couple of verses in the Bible which refer to the Antichrist perhaps coming from Dan. And also not forgetting that in the book of Revelation, Dan is not mentioned in the 12 tribes that are sealed with 144,000. Dan is left out, and Dan was the tribe that was responsible for setting up idolatry, and obviously the Antichrist is going to be the penultimate example of idolatry. In Genesis chapter 49 verses 9, which we went over when Jacob or Israel prophesied to all of the tribes of Israel, he says, Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? So that is obviously the line of the tribe of Judah, and that's where the Messiah would come from. But later on, interestingly, in Deuteronomy 33:22, Moses says, and of Dan, he calls Dan a lion's whelp, but he says that he shall leap from Bashan. And Bashan is where all the Nephilim were. Og of Bashan, he was from that area as well. And in Psalm 22, which is David prophesying about Jesus' experience on the cross in the first person, about him being pierced, Jesus says, many bulls have compassed me, strong bulls of Bashan have beset me round. So those are demons, the demonic entities which came from the Nephilim and the giants. So there's definitely something suspicious about Dan that is missing out of the book of Revelation in the 12 tribes listed. Moses prophesied that he would leap from Bashan. He has a serpent associated with him. He's also called a lion's whelp, and we know that Satan is he prowls around like a roaring lion, but he's a fraud, and he's not genuine. But the most important thing about Dan in all of this, which I consider, is that if Genesis chapter 49 is an astronomical and an astrological explanation of the tribes of Israel associated with the constellations in the heavens, it says very clearly, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. That is the constellation of Libra. Then it says, Genesis 49:17, Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path that biteth the horse's heel, so that his rider shall fall backwards. And I think we've established that that is the constellation of Scorpio. So there in verse chapter 16 and 17, we see that it is listed, the constellations, in the order that they are in the sky, which is Libra, the scales, or as we know, the holy altar. Then the serpent, which we've established, is the scorpion. And in the very next verse, which sticks out of the whole chapter completely, it says, I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord. Woo!